Hello, welcome to my devlog series. This week I completed the attack animations of the player. I had the week off from work and had more time to do things in the game. The animations were time consuming and something else got in the way of working on this game. I have been playing Demon's Souls for a week now and it was great. Somehow I managed to stop playing sometimes and actually work on my game. For this week I decided to make all attack animations for the player. That's like 6 or 7 frames in 8 directions. I have also been keeping track of the feedback I get from you guys or other social sites. Most of the feedback are great ideas, so I decided to take notes and implement them. So, for the attack animations, I first had to come up with a weapon for the player. I didn't want the weapon to be a sword, as is pretty common in action RPG games. A bow stick would be better for the player, as his sister carries a wooden spear. I imagine both of them training with their weapons. Anyway, I searched for a battle stance reference with a bow stick. These images give me a lot of ideas for future combos, but for now I will only do a single attack. The idea is to give the player a chain of 3 attacks, but only when the attack skill is level up. I decided to only make the front view of the attack to figure things out. Later, when everything is working perfectly, I will make the rest of the directions. When I finished with the front attack animation, I ported the graphics to Unity. Now I realized I never told you how the attack works. The character has a child object with a collider that acts as the area of the attack. This is normally disabled, but when the player presses the attack button, it's enabled. I also had to change the speed of the animation, as the attack I used in the prototype was only a frame. I made a test to see how things were working out. The feel of the attack was right, but something was working strange. When I exported the graphics of the attack, I applied some transparency to the trail of the weapon, but in Unity it was fully opaque. I double checked the animation in Sprite, but everything was correct. Then I realized what was the mistake. The shader I made for the flash effect. This shader overrides the transparency of the sprite, and the material was set to be fully opaque, at least until the player gets hit and it becomes transparent. To be sure, I made a test changing the material of the character. I used the default sprite material and the transparency was there. So I went back to export the attack animation again. Only this time I will separate the player from the trail of the weapon. This way I could use the trail in a separate object with the correct transparency. I tried to use the object that has the collider of the attack for this new animation, but later I realized that was a mistake. That object rotates with the attack animation and will rotate the sprite of the trail as well. I made some adjustments in the code to trigger this animation at the same time as the players. The trail object will use the animation manager I made for the prototype, so this didn't take too long. This is the moment when I realized that something was wrong. I totally forgot that the attack object did rotate with the attack animation. At first, I thought that it was an animator problem, but when I saw that everything was working correctly, I realized where the problem was. So I made a new object for the trail of the weapon. It will be parented to the player's object to follow his movement, but it will be a simple object, with only a sprite renderer and an animator. Then I removed both components from the attack object, the one with the collider. However, there was a problem. The code I made was called from the attack object, and I didn't want to create another script to only handle the weapon trail animation. So I decided to serialize the animator of the trail object and modify it from the attack object. Now it was working correctly. I could have the trail with a standard shader and the player with the one I made. Then I needed to add another piece to the attack animation, the baby octopus. When the player attacks, there is a sudden movement, so the octopus has to move likewise. This animation will also help the feeling of weight and strength of the attack. The octopus will close its eyes when the player attacks, as it doesn't want to get dizzy. So in total there will be 3 separate sprites for the complete attack animation: player, weapon trail, and baby octopus. I imported the baby octopus animation to Unity. It shares the pivot point with the player, so the movements will match. I created a new animation for the baby octopus. I don't know if you remember, but in the last episode I talked about how I changed the sorting order of the pet to be in front or in the back of the player. It's managed by the position of the pet itself, especially the Y coordinate. I changed the position by code, but then I realized that it would be better to change it in the animation itself. Then I had to do the same I did with the weapon trail object. When the player triggers the attack, it will tell the pet to start the attack animation in the same direction that he did. Now it was time to test the 3 animation in action. It was working great, but I didn't want to get back to Sprite and make the other 7 attack directions. So I decided to review the feedback I got from you guys. The first thing on the list was to increase the player's knockback. On the prototype, it was applied with little force, and people pointed it out. This was easy to fix, as this knockback force and timer is handled by the weapons of the enemies. They determine how hard and how long the player is pushed back. Since I was adjusting this knockback, I decided to increase a bit the knockback of the enemies as well. I think that now is much better, isn't it? The next thing on the list is applying knockback to the enemy when they got hit for the last time. In the prototype, they didn't get pushed back in the last hit, so it was a little weird. I had to modify the code a bit for making this change, but it was easy to implement. I also removed the transparency effect from the enemies, as it was confusing. Here is the new behavior in action. In the previous episode I implemented a small screen shake. It is triggered when the player gets hit, but it was way too subtle and most people didn't notice it. Some people suggested that it should be a big screen shake when the player gets hit, and a little one when you harm the enemies. To change the big screen shake, I only had to modify some values. I did some tests and come up with a value that I was happy with. However, to make the screen shake in the player's strikes, I needed to add some code. I decided to implement it in the attack properties component, as it has the collider that detects if the player has hit anything. This effect will be smaller than the other one, as it is expected to be reproduced more often. Having done this, I move on to change the player speed. A lot of people said that the game felt slow, and the difference between the dash speed and the walking speed was too great. For changing the speed, I only need to modify a value in the player controller script. What do you think about the new speed? Leave a comment below. Another thing that people pointed out is that enemies change their aim when they are done charging an attack. They start the attack looking at one direction, but when it's time to actually attack, they always face the player. This was a bit confusing and added some unnecessary difficulty to the game. To aim at the player, I had a function called Look at Target. It receives the position of the player and changes the direction of the enemy to face him. To fix this issue, I only had to move this function to the right state of the enemy. Instead of looking at the player in the attack state, they will do it in the pre-attack state. This state is very short, and only plays the animation to let the player know when an attack is about to happen. The next thing on the list was a flash effect for the enemies, similar to the player's dash. It will be used to indicate that the enemy is about to attack. For this I could use the shader I made in the last episode. The enemy controller script will have a reference to the shader, and change the color of the tint. The script that controls these values of the shader is called Play Shader Controller, but I can use it for the enemies as well. I have to change the name of that script at some point. To test this new functionality, I added a red flash to the enemies when they get hurt, something similar to the player's damage effect. Now it was time to use the effect to warn the player about an enemy attack. I decided to serialize the color of the effect and the time it will last. This way I can apply different effects to different enemies. Here is the result. With that done, I could move on to the next thing on the list. Some people pointed out that the movement was too clunky. That's because the input, as it is right now, returns a normalized value. This means that there are only 3 values the input stick can have, -1, 0 and 1. Using this normalized value makes the speed of the player be constant, and not being influenced by how the player presses the stick. For example, if the stick is pressed a bit, the player won't move slowly. Using an analog value for the input will change this behavior. I tried modifying the speed of the animation as well, using the movement speed as a reference. But it didn't convince me, so I will leave the regular speed of the animation. By the way, using this analog value for the movement input unlocks more directions for the movement. The player is no longer tied to the 8 directions, he can move freely in the world. What do you think about this change? What I will do with this new movement style is changing the animation of the player when he fully presses the stick. When this happens, the character will start running, and I thought about making the dash only available when running. We'll see how that goes. There are a couple of things left in the feedback list, but I will come back to that later. Now it was time to do all the direction for the attack animation. This process is time consuming, but I will probably mirror some frames to ease the workload. To not end feed up, I decided to drag one direction and then implement it in Unity. That way I won't have to do 7 attack animations all at once, and go insane. I even tested the animations a bit and blow off steam on the poor enemies. I had to manually adjust the collider of the attack for each animation. This way of doing things gave me control over how the attack behaves. I repeated the process for the remaining directions of the attack. It was a lot of work, but I think the result is worth it. And some of the animations were mirrored, so I didn't have to do all the frames. Once I managed to finish all the frames of the animations, I jumped back into Unity. I had to make every animation for the player, the trail of the weapon, and the pet. But once I figured out the sequence, it was pretty mechanical work. While making this, I realized that we reached 100 subscribers. So I decided to make a special video for that occasion. It will be about playing my first game and commenting it. Something like a post-mortem 5 years later. Anyway, that was my week. It was great to be off work, so I could spend more time on making these animations. Otherwise, I think I would spend several weeks to get it done. Thank you so much for 100 subscribers and your support. If you enjoyed the content, please subscribe as it helps me a lot, and you will receive notification from my weekly devlogs. Do you have any suggestion or feedback about the game or the channel? Any ideas of what should I implement next? Leave a comment with your ideas. See you next week.